What up, infidels? Welcome to the Friday episode of the Dangerous Brown podcast. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate it. The sleeper cell is small, but it is growing, so I am glad you guys are here. Okay. Today, it's been a while since we've done a presidential dick energy, but it's time. It's time. Last time we did Dimmy. Last time we did Jimmy. Jesus, I can't talk. I was about to say Jimmy Ford. Last time we did Jimmy Carter. I gave him small dick energy because my TikTok live got banned while I was talking about him. So, Jimmy, I know you've done a lot of things post presidency that are, humanitarian. I know he builds houses, all that sort of stuff, but still at his old age too. But I don't care, cause somehow you affected my life directly, which is a little bit insane. I remember one time, speaking of Jimmy Carter, I went on a date with a girl, and she was like, 20, 22, 23, and, this is a couple years ago. And Jimmy Carter, we're watching a movie, and it has, like, historical footage of Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter is talking about how, like, America was, at the time, wasn't the best place. And you'll see here when I go, today we're doing Gerald Ford. And you'll see, sorry for burping into the mic, that was rude. But we're doing Gerald Ford, and you'll see, like, America wasn't a good place when Jimmy Carter was president, not really. And he's talking about how there was a sort of crisis in faith in the American system during the movie. And the girl yells out, it's an empty movie theater. This is the only time she yelled out, but she goes, "That's because you were president." And I was like, you're 23. How do you have, like, strong opinions on Jimmy Carter? That's so weird. Because it's not like he's, the reality, as history goes on, it's not like he was one of the big presidents. You know what I mean? That's, like, historically relevant. But she yelled it out in a movie theater. I was so confused. And then she never texted me back. I may have, dodged a bullet there, but at the same time, like, damn. How'd I mess that up? You're the one yelling in the movie theater about Jimmy Carter. You know? Weird, dude. Weird. Gerald Ford. That's who we're doing today. Another one-term president, and usually one-term presidents, as so far, I judge a little bit harshly. I mean, it's almost impossible to get a big dick energy as a one-term president. I would say, I mean, I don't think I'm gonna give Ford big dick energy, but I will say this: Ford was not elected to office. He's the only president we had that wasn't elected. Ford comes on the heels of Nixon quitting, and then Nixon's vice president quitting. Nixon quit due to Watergate. Nixon's vice president quit due to a second scandal that was happening at the same time. He was like a politician. His name was Spiro Agnew, which all-time great name. But Spiro Agnew, he was a vice president for Nixon. He was a Baltimore City politician. So when they started, the Watergate investigation was happening at around the same time as investigation into the corruption in Baltimore politics, and it kind of revolved around Agnew. So Agnew quit from that to get some heat off the administration. When Agnew quit, Nixon then appointed Ford as the vice president because Ford was the minority leader of the House. He was the Republican leader in the House, and so it was just sort of the next pick up. And then, of course, Nixon quits, and then you have Ford. So I will say this about Ford: he never asked to be in that situation. And I'm not saying he's a saint. He was a House minority leader. He was a leader for the Republican Party. So there's obviously some shady things going on there. You don't get to that point without, making some deals that aren't wholesome, we'll say at the least. And but at the same time, being a senator, which is a huge responsibility, is still a different level than being the president of the United States. And to take that job, to not resign, is pretty ballsy. Because let's say Nixon resigns. Well, so Nixon resigns, right? Let's say then Ford goes, oh man, this is too much responsibility. I don't want it. He leaves. Then you've vacated the presidency. And nothing is more dangerous in any country than a leadership position that has been vacated, because the resulting power struggle could be bad for the country. Meaning, I don't know what politics was like at that time, but let's run this example, right? Let's say Ford quits, and now next in line is maybe Speaker of the House, right? Well, it's definitely Speaker of the House. So he becomes president. But Speaker of the House is a different party than what was elected president. The Speaker of the House, Ford doesn't have a mandate to rule, right? He sort of got into it. But the Speaker of the House definitely doesn't have a mandate because the people voted against his party, right? Let's say you have a demagogue in politics. Let's say there's a charismatic military leader who can get the people on his side and be like, look at this vacancy in the presidency. It shouldn't go to the Speaker of the House. You didn't vote for him. People, listen to me. Let a strong military leader take your place, which I don't think American politics, I was going to say has ever been like that, but I don't know. I don't know what it was like in, the 1800s and 1700s. But let's just say, for example, there was that person that existed in the 70s. Well, then you have a problem. A power vacuum is a problem. And so for Ford to step in and plug that hole is admirable. I think the quote was, let's see if I can find the quote. I have not sought this enormous responsibility, and I will not shirk from it. At a time when American confidence in its leadership was pretty low, everything I read, by the way, like I said, when I say everything I read, remember, I only look at the first couple links on Google and Wikipedia, so I could be wrong about all of this. But anything I get wrong, let me know, please. I love to learn. Instead of just calling me an idiot, just tell me. But to step into that power vacuum and fill it might have helped the country weather a rough time, and I would say the roughest time since, I was going to say since the war, the World War II, the Great Depression, but, who knows? It seems like it's always sort of tough, right? And Ford, I'm going to go over kind of quickly because of, he was just sort of placed there as like a sort of placeholder president. I mean, there's sort of a reason why the Democrats would win the next election with Jimmy Carter, right? Because it's just like the faith in the Republicans were pretty low at this point, especially after Nixon. And the more I read into it, the more I realized that the analogies between Nixon and Trump are insane. They say history repeats itself, and there is a great comic, Argus Hamilton, at the Comedy Store, who talks about how he half expected Trump to take off his mask and show that he was Nixon again inside. And, it was funny. But then the more I read into it, the more I was like, oh, this is kind of true. And that's what made the joke funny. But I'll save the Nixon talk for later because the Nixon presidential dick energy is going to be an interesting one. That's one of the more interesting politicians that America has ever had. But right now we'll talk about Ford. Let's see. It's just sort of hard to like get super into it just because he wasn't really. There's only so much he could do, right? So he has to. So at the time, Ford, when Ford was president, Ford is a Republican. Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate and made big gains in the midterm election after Nixon's resignation, because obviously, so he has to go up against that. I believe he's one of the he vetoed a lot of bills that the Senate that the Congress sent to him, and the Congress would override the veto because they had enough to override the veto. So there's a lot of just sort of that jockeying going on between the executive and legislative branches during his time. And at the same time, from everything that from the couple articles that I read, I said everything I read, it didn't seem like Nixon would sort of leave the limelight, if that makes any sense. Like, Nixon still preoccupied so much of what was going on, and that's part of the reason why Ford pardoned him. Ford gave Nixon a full pardon, so the media circus that was Nixon would stop and he could focus on being president, which, at the time was a very unpopular move. His approval rating went from 71% to 50% in that one move. And, I sort of get it from both perspectives, because as a person, you want to know that, like, you want to send that message like, hey, president, you're not above the laws of this country. That's the beauty of this country, is that even though we have an executive, he's not an absolute monarch. He's not a ruler that's above these laws. I'm sure there's certain things he can get away with, executive privilege wise, that he could definitely do that, and even a normal politician couldn't. But at the end of the day, like, if you break laws, you're still subject to them. And I think the American public wanted to see someone like that being held accountable for what they did. But at the same time, if you're Ford and you're like, I have to weather this country out of the storm that has just happened, this would be a huge scandal, which a president resigned, I need the focus to kind of be on me. And it's not like Nixon murdered anyone, directly anyways. I have to read up more on the Watergate scandal. I don't really quite know all about it. From what I understand, though, it's, they got caught breaking into the Democratic offices, trying to get dirt on, their opponent, which, hey, that's illegal, and you got caught, and you deserve the consequences. But it's like, also, isn't that kind of what politics is? I don't for a second believe Democrats weren't doing some shady stuff at that time, too. I don't for a second believe they weren't doing some shady stuff at that time. So the pardon comes, and the pardon, I think, when you step away from it, sort of makes sense. You see a lot of sort of names that take a huge role in politics. At the time, they were a huge role in politics, but later on, these sort of young Republicans then that really come into their own later. You have Donald Rumsfeld as the chief of staff, Dick Cheney. This is where he rose to political prominence during the Ford administration. I believe he might have been the Secretary of Defense during this time. I know Cheney was the Secretary of Defense twice before he was vice president. But the Dick Cheney rises. You have George W. Bush as the head of the CIA. You have not George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush as the head of the CIA. So you have these it's sort of this launching pad for these later Republican leaders, these sort of neoconservatives that appear in the early 2000s. This is sort of where they get their a perch in the government. Well, they were on the way up, obviously, at the time, but this is where they're like, okay, we are central figures in the presidential office and the cabinet and just around the presidency. I mean, this is what, 1974-ish, I believe, 1970. So Nixon was elected in 72. I think Watergate was 73, 74, in that zone. So, 1972, 73, that's how long Rumsfeld and Cheney were there till George W. Bush left office in early 2009. There is sort of this dynastic, elements to American politics that have sort of always existed, right? Once you're in, you're sort of in. That's why Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, they have this sort of grasp on the leadership of their parties. Long past overdue for all of them, really. I think they all should be gone. But that is an element of American politics. Is this sort of like, hey, once you're in, and you got to do a lot of stuff to get yourself out. And then once you're on Cheney-Rumsfeld level, if you don't mess up majorly, you're out when you say you're out. And that's what happened to them. So you see a lot of that. He, because of his pardon of Nixon, he had to testify in front of Congress. I believe I should have looked into that more. God damn, dude, I'm so dumb. But he is the first president since Lincoln to testify in front of Congress. So there is this sort of added accountability for the presidential office after Nixon leaves. He wanted he said there should be clemency for Ford here is coming in at the end of Vietnam. North Vietnam takes over South Vietnam. Saigon falls during the Ford administration. He's famous in saying like, "Hey, look, as far as we're concerned, we're done with Vietnam. Our issue with Vietnam is done." So they're sort of out. He grants clemency for draft dodgers, meaning that if you dodge the draft, if you did 2 years of public service work, or I believe 2 or 3 years of public service work, along with a couple other things, you would avoid going to jail. You avoid the traditional punishments for drafting the dodge. This wasn't enough for the liberals. Liberals wanted full clemency for draft dodgers, which, here's my Trump shot of the day. Trump shouldn't hate liberals that much. In the 70s, they were fighting for him. The economy was in a weird place during Ford's tenure. Towards the end of his tenure, you see America end up in a recession that was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression at the time. It's something in economics called stagflation, which means there's a high inflation rate, slow economic growth, and high unemployment, which apparently is like a terrible situation to be, because the stuff you would do to combat high inflation rate would slow down high economic growth and keep employment high, and the stuff you do to fight the high employment would make the inflation rate go high. So it's like it seems like a rock and a hard place. I tried to understand more about like how you would fix them, but it's just over my head. I think the more I do these, the more I'll sort of get a firmer grasp of what it is. Like, sometimes I'll read this online. It'll be like the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. And then I Googled it and I tried to learn it last night, which I should have done research for this probably earlier. I Googled it and researched it last night, and I was like, I still don't know what it means. Dude, the economy, this is just magic, dude. It's magic. You know how like Chris Angel is really good at magic? You got to be like, if you're like Alan Greenspan or whoever's in charge of the Federal Reserve, you got to be like, you're a magician to me. You're like a Chris Angel level magician. Just pulling the right strings, making everything work on the outside, and I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and I can't even begin to figure out what's going on behind the scenes. Let's see. He investigated the CIA, for sort of. So the CIA was spying, I believe, on domestic soil. They're very famous for all their assassination attempts. They got a slap on the wrist. They pretty much got a warning of like, hey, don't do bad stuff. But he investigated them. He almost had to deal with the pandemic. There was a swine flu pandemic that was worried about spreading, so he caused max vaccinations, but the pandemic never really took hold, and more people died of the vaccination than the actual flu. But it wasn't that big. It's 25 people died, which is, not to minimize that, but not to minimize their deaths, but it just shows like, hey, there was a pandemic they thought was coming, but at the end of the day, less than 25 people died. So it seems like they sort of dodged a bullet there, because I think, as we're finding out now, at times of big social unrest, a pandemic only adds fuel to the fire, and Ford sort of got lucky by avoiding that. Let's see what else. Oh, he signed the Helsinki Accords, which was a deal with the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union got more territory. The Baltic states fell to them, and in result, they agreed to increase human rights, let small things like freedom of speech and stuff. And at the time, it was widely panned by critics because the Soviet Union got more territory and gave them pretty much a domination of Eastern Europe. But the sort of loosening and the loosening of their tight grip on human rights, the sort of like people in these countries now were able to speak out against what the USSR was doing, and that's helped lead to the downfall of the USSR. Towards the 80s, I think I talked about this before. Towards the 80s, you'll see the USSR has to implement things like freedom of press and all that sort of stuff. And I think a lot of that comes from signing these accords, which is crazy that they even that the Soviet Union even agreed to like hold up the human rights section. It's crazy because it's crazy they didn't Hitler it, because like right, because Hitler promised not to take over Czechoslovakia and then just did it anyway. So if I was a Soviet Union leader at the time, I would have just been like, yeah, give us the more territory, we'll give them more human rights, and then just not have given them human rights. You know? It's weird. It's almost unexplainable to me, and I'd have to read more about it. And maybe there's someone who actually knows about Soviet stuff, but it's sort of unbelievable to me that this country ruled by an executive figure. I don't want to say they're all dictators, but executive figures who are much more powerful than any American executive figure, especially at the time, would agree to do this. Because if you take the states and then don't give the human rights, what are the other countries going to do? They're not going to attack you. You're Russia. You can't attack Russia because eventually it becomes wintertime. You can't fight Russia in the winter. Not on their soil. They will destroy you. So the fact that they did this is, I don't know what was going on there at the Soviet leadership. I believe the leader at the time was Brezhnev. I want to say it's Brezhnev. I guess he was a little more liberal. He was like for the more liberal policies in the Soviet Union. That's the only thing that sort of would make any sort of sense. It's a very weird situation, and I don't quite understand how that works. I tried to read about it, and most things told me like, hey, the more human rights loosened up, and then they were able to, like I said, speak out against the government. But it's like, why would the government even allow that? You know? It's usually you don't see people voluntarily give up power. That's usually not how that works. I don't know. At least that might be more of a gut feeling, but it seems right. People don't give up power when they're the assistant manager at Staples. Why would the head of the Soviet Union do so? What was going on there? It just makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to me. And then the sort of last thing about Ford that makes him interesting, there was 2 assassination attempts on Ford within 2 weeks of each other, both by women. What was happening there? The only time women have tried to assassinate a president was Gerald Ford, twice within 2 weeks of each other. What was going on? What did Ford do to women? I couldn't really find it. I think they were just both sort of just crazy. One of them was a Manson follower, Lynette Frum, and the other one was just sort of into radical politics. But it seems like if you're going to hate a politician of the era, Ford doesn't make any sense. It's like I said, it's not like he wanted to be president. He was just there. If anything, I thought you'd think they tried to assassinate Nixon. But no, dude. They tried to assassinate twice within 2 weeks. Only time women have tried to assassinate a president in American history. Wild. They had a moment there, huh? Ladies! Good, you know. I guess power to you, queens. I don't know what that has to, I mean, I was trying to think of my head. Maybe there's a cultural reason as to why this was happening. I believe the 70s. Let's see. I'm going to look this up. When Title IX came out. When was Title IX a thing? Sorry. So Title IX was, I mean, it's for like sports. Let's see. Title IX was passed in 1972. So this is during Ford's time, and Title IX is a Civil Rights Act where I believe it said that you had to fund women's sports. I think no. The fall No person in the United States shall, based on sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program activity receiving federal financial assistance. So it was used a lot for sports, meaning that if you're funding men's sports, you have to fund women's sports too. That's the context in which I hear Title IX most often as a lay person, as a regular person, you know. But happens in 1972. This is around the time Ford becomes president. You know, I think maybe ladies were like, this is our moment. This is our moment to assassinate the president. We can assassinate a president just like men can. And they tried. That's the only thing that makes sense maybe culturally. Other than that, this has to be a gigantic historical coincidence. It's pretty crazy. So, that's Ford in a nutshell. Half an hour, this maybe was a little long. I'm going to give him average dick energy. I think that's fair. As a president, there was nothing extra spectacular about him to give him that sort of big dick energy. The economy wasn't great. Always fighting with Congress, couldn't get Congress on his side. Republican, pro-choice, which was interesting. But his whole thing with abortion, real quick, I'll mention this, was that it should be up to the states to decide individually, which I think is the better plan. Just because if it's a federal thing, like now, people are scared that abortion is going to be illegal with the new Supreme Court justices, right? And that's the problem with the sort of federal sort of mandate on this hot topic like this, is that half the country will always try to be fighting it, and half the country will be very unhappy with it. And so if you leave it up on a state-by-state basis, that may be a better way of taming the beast, that is abortion. But he was pro-choice, which, for a conservative is very interesting to sort of take. But yeah, his presidency was nothing overly spectacular. He survived a couple assassination attempts, which is pretty dope. It's a pretty cool thing to do. I don't know any president that's tried to be assassinated twice in 2 weeks. That's pretty baller. But I can't give him little dick energy just because he stepped in and filled a void and did a job he wasn't supposed to do, and he did it admirably. I think history will look back on him as a nice guy in a bad situation. So yeah, that's the Gerald Ford dick energy episode. Guys, like, follow, tell your friends about this. If you enjoy it. It's just I appreciate you guys, the guys who listen. I feel like certain days I feel like I'm going through it. Today feels like a day I'm going through it, and then the fact that you guys sat down and listened means so much to me. If you can donate to Wikipedia, our running Wikipedia total is $65. Love you, infidels. Next week is Christmas week. Next Friday is Christmas. I probably won't release an episode Friday. I might release one Monday, but there will be a Wednesday check-in episode. But yes, thank you guys so much. See you soon.